November 12, 1944. Somewhere in the frost-hardened forests outside Saint-Dié-des-Vosges, France, Private First Class James Wesley Carter crouched behind a shattered stone wall, his fingers nearly frozen around a rifle that most soldiers in his unit had dismissed as little more than a curiosity. The modified Springfield that rested against his shoulder bore a scope fashioned from salvaged optical components, wire, and what his platoon sergeant had mockingly called Mississippi ingenuity and fool's hope. They had laughed at him 3 weeks ago when he'd first demonstrated the contraption at the rifle range behind their encampment. They would not be laughing by nightfall. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of them understood, what even James himself had not fully grasped until the moment arrived, was that sometimes the most unlikely tools in the most unlikely hands can reshape the outcome of an entire operation, turning mockery into legend and proving that excellence recognizes no boundaries, except those we foolishly construct ourselves. The morning had begun like so many others in that bitter autumn of 1944, with cold rations eaten in silence and the distant rumble of artillery, creating a constant backdrop to every thought and conversation. James had been assigned to Baker Company, 2nd Battalion, 397th Infantry Regiment of the 92nd Infantry Division, one of only 2 divisions in the entire United States Army composed primarily of African American soldiers. The division had arrived in Italy earlier that year and had since pushed northward into France as part of the larger Allied advance that sought to squeeze the German forces from multiple directions. The men of Baker Company had seen their share of difficult operations since landing on European soil. They had fought through muddy valleys and up treacherous mountain passes, facing an opponent who gave ground grudgingly and made them pay in blood for every meter gained. The statistics told one story. The official report spoke of advances measured in kilometers per day, of enemy positions reduced and territory secured. But the men who did the actual fighting knew a different truth, one measured in exhaustion, fear, and the names of friends who would never see home again. James Wesley Carter had grown up in the Delta region of Mississippi, in a small farming community where the primary crops were cotton, soybeans, and the kind of deep-rooted poverty that marked most black families in the rural South during the 1920s and 30s. His father had worked as a sharecropper, rising before dawn and returning after sunset, his hands perpetually stained with the evidence of endless labor that somehow never quite translated into security or prosperity. James had been the youngest of 5 children, and from an early age he had demonstrated an unusual gift for precision and focus. His older brother Thomas had been the first to notice it, taking young James out into the woods beyond their small house to teach him to hunt. Thomas had fashioned a simple slingshot from a forked branch and strips of rubber inner tube, and within weeks James could consistently hit targets that his brother struggled to reach. By the time he was 10 years old, James could bring down a squirrel from 30 yards with nothing but that crude weapon, and by 12 he was trusted with his father's ancient single-shot rifle, a battered firearm that dated back to the previous century but still functioned well enough to put food on the table. What separated James from other young hunters in the area was not merely his accuracy, though that was formidable, but his patience and his almost preternatural ability to calculate distance, wind, and timing without conscious thought. He seemed to possess an innate understanding of trajectory and motion, as if he could see invisible lines connecting his position to his target, lines that he could trace with absolute confidence. His father had once remarked that James could probably count the whiskers on a rabbit from 100 paces and tell you which way the wind was blowing just by watching the grass bend. When the war came, when Japanese aircraft had attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, James had been working as a farmhand on a larger property 20 miles from his family home, saving money with vague dreams of perhaps attending one of the Negro colleges he had heard about, places where a young black man might learn a trade or profession beyond agricultural labor. The attack changed everything, as it did for millions of young Americans, and within 3 months James found himself at an induction center, raising his right hand and swearing to defend a country that had never quite seen fit to defend him. The military training had been segregated naturally, conducted at facilities where black recruits were kept separate from their white counterparts, instructed by a mix of black non-commissioned officers and white commissioned officers who varied dramatically in their attitudes and competence. James had excelled at marksmanship training, achieving scores that would have earned him immediate recognition in any integrated unit. But in the reality of 1942, excellence was noted, filed away, and ultimately subordinated to the prevailing racial hierarchies of the time. He had been assigned to the 92nd Infantry Division, a unit with a distinguished history dating back to the First World War, when it had been among the first African-American divisions to see combat in France. The division's shoulder patch bore a buffalo, a reference to the buffalo soldiers of the frontier army, those black cavalry troopers who had served with distinction in the decades following the Civil War. There was pride in that heritage, a sense of continuing a legacy of service despite the obstacles and indignities that came with it. By November of 1944, James had been in Europe for 8 months and had participated in numerous operations as part of Baker Company's rifle platoon. He had proven himself to be a reliable soldier, steady under fire, good at following orders and maintaining his equipment. His superiors knew he was an excellent shot, one of the best in the company. But the nature of infantry combat in the European theatre did not always provide opportunities for precision marksmanship. Most engagements involved rapid movement, suppressive fire, and the chaotic close-quarters work of clearing buildings or defending hastily prepared positions. It was during a relatively quiet period in early October, when Baker Company had been pulled back for rest and resupply, that James had begun working on his Scope project. The company had been bivouacked in a small French town that had been liberated weeks earlier, and the men had enjoyed a brief respite from the constant pressure of frontline operations. James had been exploring an abandoned German position on the outskirts of town when he discovered a damaged optical device, possibly part of a rangefinder or artillery scope, lying among the debris of a hasty retreat. The device was broken, its housing cracked and several of its internal components missing or shattered. But James recognized that some of its lenses remained intact and functional. He carefully extracted the usable pieces and brought them back to the company area, where he spent his off-duty hours examining them and contemplating possibilities. He had no formal training in optics or engineering, nothing beyond what he had learned through trial and error as a boy, fashioning slingshots and fishing lures from whatever materials came to hand. But he possessed something perhaps more valuable, an intuitive understanding of mechanical principles and an absolute refusal to accept that something could not be done simply because he had never seen it done before. Over the course of 2 weeks, working mostly in the evening hours after the day's duties were complete, James assembled his scope. He used a section of pipe he had found in a ruined barn, carefully filed and smoothed to create a housing for the salvaged lenses. He fashioned mounting brackets from strips of metal cut from tin cans and bent to precise angles. He created adjustment mechanisms using screws and springs scavenged from various sources, testing and retesting each component until it moved smoothly and held its position. The entire assembly was secured to his Springfield rifle using wire wrapping and small clamps that he had traded cigarettes to obtain from the company's armorer. The result was undeniably crude in appearance, a Frankenstein assemblage of mismatched parts and improvised solutions that looked more like something from a junkyard than a precision instrument. When James first demonstrated it to his squad mates, showing them how he could clearly see targets at ranges that would be mere blurs to the naked eye, they had reacted with a mixture of amusement and skepticism. Corporal Henderson, a stocky man from Philadelphia, who served as the squad's second in command, had examined the device with barely concealed contempt. Henderson was a by-the-book soldier who believed that proper equipment came from proper channels and that improvisation was just another word for unreliability. "You really think that piece of junk is going to work when it matters, Carter?" Henderson had asked, his tone making clear that he expected no useful answer. "What happens when those tin can brackets come loose in the middle of a fight? What happens when that pipe housing cracks from the recoil? You'll be standing there with a useless rifle while the rest of us are actually engaging the enemy." Private Elmore Washington, James's closest friend in the unit, had been more supportive, but only marginally more optimistic. Washington was a tall, lanky man from Detroit who had worked in an automobile factory before the war and possessed his own share of mechanical aptitude. "I don't know, James," Washington had said quietly after examining the scope one evening. "I can see you put a lot of work into this, and maybe it functions fine on the range when everything is calm and you have time to set up your shot. But combat is different, man. Everything is moving. Everything is chaotic. I just worry that you're putting faith in something that might fail you when you need it most." Even the company's armorer, a grizzled sergeant named Morris who had served in the previous war and had seen just about every variation of weapon modification imaginable, had expressed doubts, though his were more practical than dismissive. "The concept is sound enough," Morris had told James when asked to inspect the scope for safety issues. "I've seen scopes mounted on Springfields before, though usually they're manufactured items from companies that specialize in this sort of thing. Your craftsmanship is actually pretty impressive for someone working with salvaged materials, but the real question is durability. Can this thing maintain zero after repeated firing? Can it hold up to field conditions, to rain and mud, and the kind of rough handling that happens in combat? I honestly don't know, Private. I hope it works for you, but I would not want to bet my life on it." Lieutenant Robert Jameson, the platoon leader, had been the most openly skeptical. Jameson was a white officer from Virginia, a graduate of a small military college, who had arrived in Europe 6 months earlier as a replacement officer, and had yet to fully win the trust of his men. He was not actively hostile or prejudiced in the way some officers were, but he operated with a set of assumptions about competence and capability that often seemed to sort along racial lines, whether he consciously intended them to or not. "Private Carter," Jameson had said when James requested permission to carry the modified rifle into combat, "I appreciate initiative, and I recognize that you have put considerable effort into this project, but I have serious concerns about introducing non-standard equipment into our operations. Every weapon in this platoon needs to be reliable and proven. I cannot have men depending on gear that might fail at a critical moment. I'm going to have to deny your request. You will carry your standard-issue Springfield without modifications." James had not argued, had not pushed back against the lieutenant's decision, because that was not how things worked, not for a black private in a segregated unit in 1944. "You took your orders, you said yes, sir, and you found another way if you believed strongly enough in what you were trying to accomplish." So James had nodded, acknowledged the lieutenant's decision, and continued to maintain his modified rifle alongside his standard weapon, practicing with it whenever he had the opportunity, making small adjustments to improve its function, and waiting for a moment that he somehow knew would come. That moment arrived on a cold November morning, when Baker Company received orders to advance through a densely wooded area toward a crossroads that intelligence reported as lightly defended. The crossroads controlled access to 2 roads that led deeper into the region, and securing it would allow the division to continue its push forward while denying the Germans a potential route for counterattack or withdrawal. The company moved out before dawn, 3 platoons advancing in a staggered formation, with scouts ranging ahead to detect any enemy positions. James was positioned near the center of his platoon's formation, carrying his standard Springfield and his pack, but he had also managed to bring his modified rifle, broken down into components and wrapped in canvas, stuffed into his pack against regulations, but present nonetheless. If Henderson or any of the sergeants noticed the extra weight James was carrying, they said nothing, perhaps because they had learned that sometimes it was easier to let soldiers carry their good luck charms and personal totems than to enforce every regulation to the letter. The advance proceeded smoothly for the first 2 hours, the company covering nearly 3 kilometers without encountering resistance. The forest was dense, a mix of pine and hardwood trees that blocked much of the sunlight even at midday and created an environment of shadows and muffled sounds. The temperature hovered just above freezing, cold enough that breath created visible clouds, but not so cold that the ground had frozen solid. The men moved carefully, weapons at ready, eyes scanning the terrain for any sign of enemy presence. At approximately 0830 hours, the point squad reported movement ahead, and the company commander ordered a halt while scouts investigated. James and the rest of his platoon took positions behind available cover, waiting in the particular kind of tense silence that every combat soldier learns, A silence where you try to hear everything while revealing nothing about your own position. The scouts returned 15 minutes later with troubling news. Approximately 800 yards ahead, the forest opened into a broad clearing that surrounded the crossroads. The clearing was roughly circular, extending 500 yards in each direction from the intersection, and it was not as lightly defended as intelligence had suggested. The scouts had observed German positions on the far side of the clearing, what appeared to be at least a reinforced platoon, perhaps 40 to 50 men, with machine gun positions and prepared fighting holes that suggested they had been there for several days and were dug in for a sustained defense. Captain William Thornton, the company commander, conferred with his platoon leaders to assess options. The tactical situation was problematic. The clearing was too wide to cross quickly. Any advance across open ground would expose the attacking force to withering fire from prepared positions, and the forest was too dense on the flanks to easily maneuver around the German position. Artillery support was available, but limited. The division's guns were supporting operations elsewhere, and could only provide a brief preparatory bombardment, nothing like the sustained shelling that would be needed to thoroughly suppress or destroy the defending force. After 20 minutes of discussion, Captain Thornton made his decision. The company would assault across the clearing following a 10-minute artillery preparation, 3 platoons advancing simultaneously, while a heavy weapons section provided suppressive fire from the tree line. It was not an elegant plan, and everyone knew it would be costly, but sometimes in war there are no good options, only choices between different types of bad outcomes. As the platoons prepared for the assault, checking ammunition, fixing bayonets, and making the mental preparations necessary to run toward danger, James approached Lieutenant Jameson with a request that even he recognized was borderline insubordinate given the circumstances. "Lieutenant, request permission to speak, sir." Jameson looked up from the map he had been studying, clearly preoccupied with the imminent assault and not particularly interested in whatever Private Carter wanted to discuss. "Make it quick, Private." "Sir, I believe I can help soften up those German positions before we advance. I have the modified rifle I showed you last month, and from a concealed position at the tree line, I can engage targets at ranges where they will not expect accurate fire. I can take out their machine gunners, their leaders, anyone who exposes themselves to direct defensive preparations. It will not eliminate their position, but it will disrupt them, force them to keep their heads down, maybe make them uncertain about what they are facing." Jameson stared at James for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Around them, soldiers were conducting the 100 small tasks that preceded combat. Men were writing quick letters to be mailed if they survived, checking each other's equipment, saying things that might be final words if the assault went badly. "Private Carter," Jameson said slowly, "we are about to conduct a coordinated assault across open ground against a prepared enemy position. This is not the time for experiments with homemade equipment. I need every rifle in the assault line, not off doing some lone wolf nonsense at the tree line. Sir, respectfully, 1 rifle in the assault line will make almost no difference to the outcome, but 1 rifle eliminating key targets before the assault begins could save half a dozen lives, maybe more. These men are my brothers, Lieutenant. I am not asking to sit out the fight. I am asking to fight in the way that I know I can be most effective." Something in James's tone, perhaps the absolute conviction in his voice, or perhaps the simple fact that Jameson was desperate enough to consider anything that might improve their chances, caused the lieutenant to pause and reconsider. "How many rounds?" Jameson asked. "I have 40 rounds of ammunition that I have been saving, hand-selected for consistency. I can get off 12 to 15 aimed shots in the time before the assault begins. And if your contraption fails after the first shot? Then I will immediately move to the assault line with my standard rifle, and you will have lost nothing, sir." Jameson looked past James toward the clearing they would soon have to cross, calculating odds and weighing risks in the way that young officers did when they held lives in their hands, and knew that every decision might haunt them forever. "You get 10 minutes, Private, from the end of the artillery preparation until we step off for the assault. You engage targets of opportunity, focusing on crew-served weapons and anyone who looks like leadership. You do not, under any circumstances, stay behind when we advance. If you are not in the assault line when we move, I will personally charge you with cowardice. Are we clear?" "Crystal clear, sir. Thank you, sir." James moved quickly then, finding a position at the tree line where a fallen log provided both concealment and a stable rest for his rifle. He assembled his modified Springfield with practiced efficiency, attaching the scope assembly and making minute adjustments to ensure everything was properly aligned. He examined the clearing carefully, studying the German positions, noting where he could see movement, identifying the locations of their machine guns and the spots where soldiers appeared to be directing the defense. The artillery preparation began at 0900 hours exactly, a 10-minute barrage from 3 batteries of 105mm howitzers positioned several kilometers to the rear. The shells screamed overhead and impacted in and around the German positions, throwing up great fountains of earth and smoke, temporarily obscuring the far side of the clearing. James knew that the bombardment, while impressive in its sound and fury, would likely do limited damage to troops who were dug in and expecting it. The real value was in keeping their heads down and creating chaos that would make his own shots harder to anticipate. As the final shells fell and the smoke began to clear, James settled behind his rifle and began the ritual he had performed hundreds of times in practice, but never in actual combat. He controlled his breathing, slowing it deliberately, letting his body find its natural rhythm. He observed the wind by watching the movement of grass at various distances across the clearing, noting how it bent and swayed, translating that movement into mental calculations about wind speed and direction. He estimated the range to his primary targets at approximately 600 yards, a distance that would challenge even an experienced sniper with professional equipment. But James did not think about the difficulty or the odds. He thought only about the shot, about the invisible line connecting his position to his target. His first target appeared as the smoke cleared, a German soldier who emerged from a fighting hole and began directing other soldiers to their positions. From the way others responded to him, James judged him to be a non-commissioned officer, perhaps a squad leader, exactly the kind of target whose removal would create confusion and delay. James centered the crosshairs, a crude cross pattern he had etched into glass from the salvaged lenses, and let his breathing settle into the natural pause between exhalation and inhalation, that moment of perfect stillness that every shooter seeks. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, the sound of the shot sharp in the cold morning air, and James worked the bolt smoothly, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a fresh round while keeping his eyes on the target area. 600 yards away, the German non-commissioned officer collapsed, visible for just a moment, before other soldiers dragged him back into cover. James did not pause to celebrate or even fully register what had just happened. He was already searching for his next target, his mind cool and focused, operating on instinct and training. A machine gun position revealed itself as soldiers scrambled to bring the weapon into action, and James centered on the gunner, the man responsible for operating the weapon, the one whose removal would render the gun temporarily useless. Second shot, smooth trigger press, proper follow-through. The gunner fell, and James could see confusion in the enemy position as soldiers tried to understand where the fire was coming from. Third shot, the assistant gunner who moved to take over the weapon. Fourth shot, a soldier attempting to look over the edge of his fighting hole toward the American positions. Fifth shot, another leader type who was attempting to organize a response. By his sixth shot, approximately 4 minutes into his 10-minute window, the German position had descended into near chaos. They knew they were taking casualties. They knew someone was engaging them with accurate fire, but they could not effectively identify the source or respond. The distance was too great for most of their small arms to be effective, and their instinct was to stay low and avoid exposure, rather than attempt to locate and suppress a threat they could not clearly see. James continued his methodical work, shot after shot, each one carefully aimed, each one intended to remove a specific threat or create a specific effect. He targeted another machine gun position, then a soldier who appeared to be using a radio, likely trying to call for support or reinforcements. He aimed at a position where he saw movement that suggested someone preparing an anti-tank weapon, though he could not be entirely certain of the target type. By his 12th shot, James had been operating for just under 8 minutes, and he could hear Lieutenant Jameson calling for the assault to prepare to step off. James took careful aim one final time, targeting a German soldier who had been attempting to direct fire from other positions, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle fired, the target fell, and James immediately began breaking down his scope assembly, working with furious speed to remove the device and stow it, while retrieving his standard rifle. He reached the assault line with seconds to spare, sliding into position next to Elmore Washington, who stared at him with wide eyes that held a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Brother, what did you just do out there?" Washington whispered urgently. "I was watching those German positions through my field glasses, and I swear I saw at least 10 of them go down, all from ranges that should not be possible with iron sights." "I used the scope," James replied simply. It worked. Before Washington could respond, Lieutenant Jameson's whistle blew and the assault began. 3 platoons rising from the tree line and advancing across the clearing in a long skirmish line, weapons firing, men running in the crouched gait that tried to balance speed with some semblance of cover. The German return fire, which should have been immediate and devastating from prepared positions against troops crossing open ground, was sporadic and disorganized. The machine guns that should have been raking the assault line with overlapping fields of fire were largely silent, their crews casualties of James's shooting or still too disrupted to function effectively. The defensive fire that did come was wild and poorly aimed, soldiers shooting without proper targets, firing blindly toward the advancing Americans in the hope of hitting something rather than executing the coordinated defense they had surely planned. Baker Company reached the German positions with fewer casualties than anyone had dared hope for, and the fighting that followed was brief and decisive. The defenders, already shaken and demoralized by the accurate long-range fire that had picked apart their leadership and heavy weapons, surrendered quickly once American soldiers were actually in their positions. Within 20 minutes of the assault beginning, the crossroads was secure and more than 40 German soldiers were being gathered as prisoners. Captain Thornton conducted an immediate after-action assessment, trying to understand why an assault that should have been extremely costly had succeeded with relatively light casualties. He interviewed the platoon leaders, examined the captured positions, and spoke with several of the German prisoners through an interpreter. What he learned astonished him. The prisoners reported that approximately 12 of their soldiers had been struck by long-range rifle fire before the assault began, including both of their machine gun crews, their platoon sergeant, their communications specialist, and several squad leaders. They described being unable to effectively return fire because they could not identify where the shots were originating from, and being convinced that they were facing multiple snipers with professional equipment, rather than a single shooter with a modified rifle. The psychological impact had been severe. The surviving soldiers had been certain they were going to die if they exposed themselves for even a moment, and when the actual assault came, their cohesion was already broken. It was Sergeant Morris, the company armorer, who made the connection and brought it to Captain Thornton's attention. Morris had been examining the captured German positions and had noticed something unusual about many of the casualties. They had been struck in the upper body or head with shots that showed remarkable precision, all from angles consistent with fire from the tree line at extreme range. "Sir," Morris said to the captain, "I think I know what happened here. You remember that private with the homemade scope? Carter from 2nd Platoon. I am willing to bet he is responsible for this." Thornton had Carter brought to the company command post, which had been established in a captured German bunker near the crossroads. When James arrived, still carrying his standard rifle and looking uncertain about why he had been summoned, the captain studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Private Carter, I am hearing some remarkable things about shooting that occurred before our assault this morning. Sergeant Morris believes you were responsible. Is that accurate?" "Yes, sir," James replied. "Lieutenant Jameson gave me permission to engage targets prior to the assault. I used my modified rifle to eliminate threats that I could clearly identify." "How many targets did you engage?" 12, sir. I had ammunition for more, but I needed to join the assault line before we stepped off." Captain Thornton exchanged glances with the other officers present, and James saw something in their expressions shift, a recalibration of assumptions and expectations. "Private, those 12 shots may have saved a dozen lives or more among our men. That assault should have cost us dearly, but your shooting disrupted their entire defense before we ever left the tree line. I am going to make sure your actions today are properly recognized." Over the following days, as Baker Company continued operations in the region, word spread throughout the battalion about what James had accomplished. The story grew slightly in the telling, as combat stories always do, but the core facts remained undeniable. A single soldier with a scope assembled from salvaged parts had engaged and eliminated 12 enemy soldiers from 600 yards, fundamentally altering the outcome of an assault that could have been catastrophic. Lieutenant Jameson, to his credit, acknowledged his earlier skepticism in a conversation with James 3 days after the Crossroads operation. The platoon had been holding a defensive position while other units passed through to continue the advance, and Jameson had sought James out during a quiet moment. "Private Carter, I owe you an apology," the lieutenant said without preamble. "I doubted you and your equipment, and I was wrong. You proved that sometimes the most unlikely solutions are exactly what a situation requires. I am recommending you for the Bronze Star for your actions at the Crossroads, and I am also requesting that you be permanently authorized to carry your modified rifle as your primary weapon. The battalion commander has approved both recommendations." James accepted the apology and the recognition with quiet gratitude, but what mattered most to him was not the medal or the authorization, though both were meaningful, but rather the shift in how his fellow soldiers regarded him. Men who had mocked his scope now asked him questions about how it worked and how he had learned to shoot with such precision. Soldiers from other platoons sought him out to hear the story directly from him, rather than through the embellished versions that circulated through the company. Corporal Henderson, who had been among the most dismissive of James's project, approached him one evening as the company gathered for an evening meal of hot rations that had been brought forward from the rear. "Carter, I want you to know that I was wrong about you and that scope of yours," Henderson said, his tone carrying none of its earlier contempt. "I judged you before I saw what you could do, and that was unfair. I'm glad you proved me wrong, and I'm especially glad that your shooting saved lives. Some of those men who made it across that clearing are friends of mine, and they are alive because of you." "Thank you, Corporal," James replied. "I appreciate you saying that." Furious, what James did not tell Henderson or any of the others was that the success of that day had been as much about preparation and practice as about the scope itself. He had spent months learning his equipment, understanding its quirks and limitations, developing the muscle memory and mental discipline necessary to shoot with precision under pressure. The scope had been a tool, an important one certainly, but the real difference had been his absolute commitment to mastering that tool, despite the mockery and skepticism he had faced. In the weeks that followed, James became something of an informal specialist within Baker Company, called upon whenever a situation required precision engagement at extended ranges. He participated in several operations where his ability to eliminate specific targets proved valuable, and he continued to refine his scope, making small improvements as materials became available and as he learned from experience what worked and what did not. By December of 1944, as winter settled over Europe and the German forces launched their surprise offensive in the Ardennes that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, James and his modified rifle had become a recognized asset within the battalion. His superiors understood that he represented a unique capability, and they used him accordingly, not as a standard rifleman in the assault line, but as someone who could influence outcomes from positions of concealment and at ranges where most soldiers could not effectively engage. The statistical record of James's service, preserved in after-action reports and award citations, documents at least 37 confirmed enemy casualties attributed to his shooting between November of 1944 and the end of the war in Europe in May of 1945. The actual number was likely higher, as not every engagement was fully documented and not every distant target could be confirmed as a casualty, rather than simply knocked out of action temporarily. But the numbers, while impressive, tell only part of the story. The more significant impact was in the missions that succeeded because key enemy positions were neutralized before assault, in the casualties that were avoided because German machine gunners were eliminated before they could bring their weapons to bear, in the boosted morale of men who knew they had someone watching over them, who could reach out and touch enemy soldiers at distances that seemed almost magical. The scope itself, that assemblage of salvaged lenses and improvised components, survived the entire war and returned with James to the United States in August of 1945. He kept it for the rest of his life, occasionally showing it to family members or fellow veterans who asked about his service, but he never fired it again after the war ended. It sat in a carefully maintained case in his home, a reminder of a time when he had been forced to prove himself over and over, when excellence had not been assumed or rewarded, but had to be demonstrated despite obstacles and doubts. James returned to Mississippi after his discharge, using the educational benefits provided by the GI Bill to attend trade school and eventually establishing a small machine shop in Jackson. He married in 1947, raised 4 children, and lived what by most measures would be considered a quiet and successful life. He spoke rarely about his wartime experiences, not out of trauma or unwillingness to share, but because in the post-war years, particularly in the segregated South, there was limited interest in hearing about the contributions of black soldiers to the victory in Europe. The recognition James received for his service, including the Bronze Star that Lieutenant Jameson had recommended, and that was eventually awarded, was meaningful but not transformative in terms of his post-war opportunities. He came home to a country that was still deeply segregated, where his status as a decorated veteran granted him no exemption from Jim Crow laws, where many of the promises implied by wartime rhetoric about freedom and democracy did not extend to citizens of his race. Yet James carried himself with a quiet dignity that those who knew him came to respect, and he instilled in his children a belief that excellence and precision were their own rewards, regardless of whether others immediately recognized them. He taught them that being underestimated could be an advantage if you had the skill and determination to prove the doubters wrong, and that sometimes the most important battles were not the dramatic ones that everyone remembered, but the quiet struggles to maintain your integrity and craft in the face of dismissal and mockery. The story of James Wesley Carter and his homemade scope gradually faded from immediate memory as the veterans of World War II aged and as the specific details of individual operations became less vivid in the collective consciousness. The 92nd Infantry Division service was documented in official histories, but the contributions of individual soldiers, particularly those whose achievements did not fit into larger narratives of famous battles or Medal of Honor citations, often went unrecorded in popular memory. It was not until the 1990s, more than 4 decades after the war's end, that a military historian researching the 92nd Division came across after-action reports that mentioned Private Carter's remarkable shooting at the crossroads near Saint-Dié-des-Vosges. The historian, a professor at a military college who was preparing a comprehensive study of African-American combat units in World War II, recognized the significance of the story and sought out James, who was then in his 70s and still living in Mississippi. The interview that followed, conducted in James's living room with his wife and one of his daughters present, was recorded and eventually deposited in a military history archive where it remains available to researchers today. In that interview, James spoke at length about his experiences, about the scope he had built, about the morning at the crossroads, and about what it had meant to serve in a segregated military, fighting for a country that did not yet recognize him as a full citizen. When asked what he wanted people to understand about his service and his story, James thought carefully before responding, choosing his words with the same precision he had once applied to shooting. "I think what matters most is not that I built a scope or that I hit some targets at long range," he said. "What matters is that excellence does not require permission or validation from others. If you know you can do something well, if you have prepared and practiced and made yourself ready, then you have an obligation to do it regardless of whether people believe in you at the outset." The crossroads was important because lives were saved, but the principle applies to everything, to education, to business, to raising a family, to being a good citizen. You do not wait for others to give you permission to be excellent. You simply become excellent and let the results speak for themselves. The historian asked about the mockery James had endured from fellow soldiers before his shooting proved his worth, and whether he had felt angry or bitter about their initial dismissiveness. "Some, sure," James acknowledged, Nobody likes being laughed at or having their work dismissed as foolishness. But I also understood where it was coming from. We had all seen too many things fail, too many grand ideas that looked good until they met the reality of combat. Skepticism was natural, even healthy in some ways. What I could not accept was the idea that because something looked crude or unusual, it could not possibly work. I knew my scope functioned because I had tested it thoroughly. I knew I could shoot accurately with it because I had practiced until it became second nature. So I was not asking them to believe in some unproven theory. I was asking them to let me demonstrate something I already knew to be true. Toward the end of the interview, the historian asked James if he could examine the scope, which James retrieved from its case, and presented with obvious pride in its construction. The historian, who had handled military equipment from multiple eras, was struck by both the ingenuity of the design and the obvious skill that had gone into its fabrication. "This is remarkable craftsmanship," the historian observed. "The fact that you created this with salvaged materials and basic tools speaks to real engineering intuition. Have you ever calculated how much money the military spent developing and producing similar equipment, while you achieved comparable results with essentially zero budget?" James smiled at that, a quiet smile that suggested he had considered that very question many times over the years. "I could not begin to tell you what they spent on scopes and optical equipment, probably millions across the entire war, but I can tell you that for me, the value was not in saving money or proving that I could do something cheaply. The value was in solving a problem that I recognized, in creating something that would make me more effective at protecting my brothers and accomplishing our missions. If I had access to a factory-made scope, I would have used it gladly, but I did not have that access, so I made what I needed from what was available. That is not heroic or exceptional, that is just being a soldier, using the resources at hand to accomplish the mission." James Wesley Carter passed away in 2003 at the age of 81, having lived to see his country make significant if incomplete progress toward the ideals of equality and justice that had been so elusive during his military service. He saw some of his grandchildren attend integrated universities, saw African Americans hold positions of authority and influence that would have been unthinkable in his youth, saw at least partial recognition of the contributions that black soldiers had made to the nation's wars. His funeral was attended by family, friends, members of his church, and a delegation from a local veterans organization who rendered military honors as his casket was lowered into the ground. The bronze star he had earned at that crossroads in France more than half a century earlier was displayed near his photograph, along with other medals and commendations he had received during his service. The scope, his famous homemade assembly of salvaged lenses and improvised components, was donated by his family to the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of African American History and Culture, where it is now displayed as part of an exhibit on black military service during World War II. The exhibit placard describes its construction and its use at the crossroads near Saint-Dié-des-Vosges, and it includes a photograph of James in his uniform, young and serious, and looking directly at the camera with eyes that had seen combat and had proven themselves capable of extraordinary precision. The lessons of James Wesley Carter's story extend beyond the immediate context of World War II or military service. They speak to the universal human experiences of being underestimated, of having to prove yourself despite skepticism, of finding creative solutions to problems when conventional resources are unavailable. They remind us that innovation often comes from unexpected sources, that excellence can emerge from circumstances that seem unlikely or even unfavorable, and that sometimes the most effective tools are not the most expensive or sophisticated, but rather those that are most thoroughly understood and mastered by their users. For the men of Baker Company who witnessed James's shooting that November morning, who saw firsthand what could be accomplished by someone they had dismissed and mocked, the impact was profound and lasting. Several of them, in interviews conducted decades later for various oral history projects, spoke about that day as a turning point in their understanding of capability and potential. They described how watching James methodically pick apart an enemy position from 600 yards had forced them to reconsider their assumptions, not just about him specifically, but about the broader question of who could accomplish extraordinary things, given the opportunity and support to develop their abilities. Corporal Henderson, who lived until 2007, was interviewed in the late 90s for a documentary about the 92nd Infantry Division. When asked what he remembered most vividly from his combat service, he did not speak about the dramatic assaults or famous battles, but about the morning he watched James Carter prove wrong everyone who had laughed at his homemade scope. "I was one of the ones who laughed," Henderson admitted in that interview, his voice carrying the weight of decades of reflection. "I saw that contraption he had put together from scrap metal and salvaged parts, and I thought it was just foolishness, a waste of time that was going to fail when he needed it most. And then I watched him use it to save maybe a dozen lives, including possibly mine, and I understood that I had been judging the tool by its appearance rather than by what it could do in skilled hands. That was a lesson I carried with me for the rest of my life, to look past surfaces and appearances and focus on capability and results. James taught me that, though he did it without ever seeming to try to teach anyone anything, just by being excellent at what he did." The 12 German soldiers who fell to James's shooting on that November morning were in most respects ordinary men who found themselves in an extraordinary and terrible conflict. They were sons and brothers, husbands and fathers, men who had been conscripted into service and sent to defend positions that ultimately could not be held. Their deaths were not more or less significant than the thousands of other casualties on both sides during that bitter autumn of 1944. But in the specific context of that morning's assault, their removal from the defensive line created a cascade of effects that fundamentally altered the outcome of the operation. The strategic importance of the crossroads that Baker Company secured that day was modest in the larger context of the war. It did not determine the outcome of major battles, it did not change the trajectory of campaigns. It was simply one of hundreds of similar objectives that had to be taken as the Allied forces ground their way through France toward Germany. But for the men who fought there, for the soldiers who crossed that clearing expecting to face devastating fire from prepared positions, the significance was profound and personal. They went home to their families after the war because James Carter had spent months building a scope from scrap materials and practicing until he could use it with absolute confidence. This is ultimately what makes James's story worth remembering and celebrating, not because it involves dramatic heroics or Medal of Honor-worthy actions in the traditional sense, but because it demonstrates how individual skill, determination and innovation can have measurable impacts on outcomes that matter. It shows us that excellence does not always announce itself with fanfare or come packaged in official channels. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a quiet private from Mississippi, with a scope that looks like it was assembled in a junkyard. And sometimes that is exactly what the situation requires. The crossroads near Saint-Dié-des-Vosges today looks much as it probably did in November of 1944, an intersection of two modest roads in a heavily forested area that sees little traffic. There is no monument or marker indicating what happened there, no plaque describing the assault or honoring those who fought. The fighting holes where German soldiers prepared their defense have long since been filled in by time and weather. The shell craters from the artillery preparation have been smoothed by decades of growth, and the forest has reclaimed any evidence that this was once a battlefield where men fought and died. But for those who know the history, who understand what happened on that cold November morning, when a single soldier with an improvised scope changed the outcome of an assault, the location holds significance as a reminder of how wars are actually fought and won. Not primarily through grand strategies or overwhelming force, though those certainly matter, but through the accumulated contributions of individuals who find ways to be effective within their specific circumstances, who solve problems with creativity and determination, who refuse to accept that excellence is beyond their reach simply because others doubt them. James Wesley Carter's homemade scope, sitting now in its climate-controlled case in the Smithsonian, represents far more than simply an interesting artifact from World War II. It stands as a physical embodiment of principles that remain relevant across contexts and generations, the principle that innovation often emerges from constraint. That necessity truly is the mother of invention, that being underestimated can become an advantage if you have the skill to prove your doubters wrong, and that sometimes the most effective solutions to complex problems come from unexpected sources, working with unconventional tools. When students and visitors examine that scope in its museum display, when they read about James and what he accomplished with it, they are encountering a story that transcends its immediate historical moment. They are learning that excellence can be found in any community, that capability is not determined by access to resources or official recognition, and that sometimes the greatest contributions come from those who were never supposed to be in a position to contribute at all. The men who laughed at James's scope before that November morning were not bad people or malicious in their mockery. They were simply operating from the assumptions and expectations that their experience had taught them, that professional equipment came through official channels, that improvisation was usually unreliable, that someone with no formal training in optics or engineering could not possibly create something that would function under combat conditions. Their laughter was not personal. It was the natural skepticism that people develop when they have seen promises unfulfilled and grand plans collapse under pressure. What makes the story powerful is not that they were wrong to be skeptical. Reasonable skepticism is healthy and appropriate, but that they were willing to recognize excellence when it was demonstrated, regardless of their initial doubts. When James proved that his scope worked, when he showed that his months of patient work had created something genuinely effective, his fellow soldiers did not cling to their skepticism or try to minimize his achievement. They acknowledged it, learned from it, and adjusted their understanding of what was possible. This willingness to update beliefs based on evidence, to let demonstrated capability overcome initial assumptions, is perhaps as important as James's technical skill with the rifle. It suggests that even within a deeply flawed system, within a military that was still segregated and operating under racial hierarchies that we now recognize as fundamentally unjust, there was still room for excellence to be recognized and for individuals to prove themselves through performance. That recognition was incomplete and inconsistent. Certainly, James returned home to a Mississippi that was still segregated by law and custom, where his status as a decorated veteran granted him no exemption from the racial restrictions of the Jim Crow South. But within the specific context of his military unit, among the men who fought alongside him, his capability was acknowledged and his contributions were valued. That acknowledgement, limited though it was, mattered both to James and to those who witnessed what he accomplished. As we look back on World War II from the perspective of more than 8 decades, as we try to understand the human dimensions of that massive conflict, beyond the strategic movements of armies and the diplomatic maneuvering of nations, stories like James Wesley Carter's become essential. They remind us that history is made by individuals making choices within their specific circumstances, that innovation and excellence can emerge from unexpected sources, and that being underestimated is not a permanent condition but rather a temporary state that can be overcome through demonstrated capability. The 12 German soldiers who fell to James's shooting at that crossroads were part of a larger pattern of defeat that was becoming inexorable for their nation by November of 1944. The strategic situation was dire. The industrial and manpower advantages held by the Allied nations were overwhelming, and the outcome of the war was becoming increasingly clear despite desperate German efforts to postpone the inevitable. But in the immediate tactical context of that morning, their defeat was not primarily about grand strategy or industrial production. It was about a single American soldier who had spent months building a scope from salvaged parts and who had practiced until he could use it with absolute precision. This is what military historians mean when they speak about the fog of war and the role of contingency in determining outcomes. Grand strategies matter, industrial capacity matters, training and doctrine matter, but individual actions at specific moments can also shape what happens in ways that reverberate beyond their immediate context. James's shooting did not determine the outcome of the war or even the outcome of the larger campaign, but it did determine that a specific assault succeeded with minimal casualties rather than failing with devastating losses. And for the men whose lives were saved by that outcome, the difference was absolute. When we honor veterans, when we remember their service and sacrifice, it is important to remember not just the famous battles and the celebrated heroes, but also the countless individual contributions that collectively made victory possible. James Wesley Carter was not famous during his lifetime, except within the relatively small circle of men who served with him. His name does not appear in most histories of World War II. His achievements were not the subject of newsreels or inspiring propaganda. But his contribution was real and measurable and significant to those it affected, and his story deserves to be told and remembered as part of the larger narrative of how the war was fought and won. The scope itself, that assemblage of salvaged lenses and improvised components, serves as a reminder that innovation does not always require laboratories and research budgets. Sometimes it requires only a clear understanding of a problem, access to basic materials, and the determination to create a solution regardless of obstacles or skepticism. James did not invent the concept of rifle scopes, did not develop new optical principles or revolutionary engineering techniques. He simply applied existing knowledge and practical skill to create something he needed from what was available. That is innovation in its most fundamental form, seeing what is needed, understanding what is possible, and doing the work to bridge the gap between the two. For young people today, particularly those from communities that have historically faced barriers to opportunity and recognition, James Wesley Carter's story offers a powerful example of how to respond to being underestimated. Not with anger or resentment, though those feelings are natural and valid, but with quiet determination to develop genuine capability and then demonstrate it through performance. Not by arguing about what you deserve or demanding recognition before you have proven yourself, but by doing the work necessary to become excellent and then letting that excellence speak for itself. This is not to suggest that systemic barriers do not exist, or that individual excellence is always sufficient to overcome structural inequalities. The realities of James's life, both during and after the war, demonstrate clearly that individual achievement does not automatically translate into equal treatment or opportunity. But within those constraints, within the limitations imposed by an imperfect and often unjust system, there remains value in pursuing excellence for its own sake, in developing capabilities that cannot be denied, and in finding ways to contribute meaningfully despite obstacles. The morning of November 12, 1944, when James Wesley Carter proved his doubters wrong and changed the outcome of an assault through extraordinary shooting with an improvised scope, was not the end of his war or the conclusion of his need to constantly prove himself. It was simply one moment among many, one day when his preparation and skill aligned with opportunity and need to create an outcome that mattered. He would face other challenges, other moments of doubt and skepticism, other situations where he would need to demonstrate his capability despite assumptions that he could not possibly succeed. But that morning at the crossroads gave him something valuable, the absolute knowledge that he could perform under pressure, that his months of preparation and practice had created genuine capability, that the mockery and dismissal had been wrong, and that he had been right to persist despite them. That knowledge, that bone-deep certainty of his own competence, was something he carried with him for the rest of his life, through the challenges of returning home to a still segregated South, through the work of building a business and raising a family, through all the ordinary struggles and triumphs of a long life. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.